Nice to see you. As I had mentioned earlier on in the program, when Liftoff launched and published the Looking Towards the Future report, business engagement was an identified priority of the kind of coalition of folks who have deep responsibility and insights to the real needs of children and the families and the workforce. And I have been wanting to continue to build our engagement with the business community. And it was only natural to go to one of the top thought leaders in this space with Caitlin to invite her to share some perspectives, her expertise with you all, and to respond to some questions that we've posed. This would normally be a fireside chat, but virtually we're just going to call it maybe if you're drinking coffee and conversation, perhaps. So thank you, Caitlin. Caitlin's also, she may reference it. She's also a mom of some little ones, so coffee is a lifeline for us. So let me just take a quick moment to introduce Caitlin and welcome her officially to Liftoff's annual convening. For those of you who are less familiar with Caitlin's work, let me tell you a little bit about her. Caitlin is the Vice President of Policy and Programs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. Caitlin has developed and overseen the foundation's programs for early childhood education, K-12 education, and its commitment to college and career readiness. She has decades of experience in public policy and project management and has spearheaded the development and implementation of many of the Chamber's education programs and initiatives, including the Business Leads Fellowship Program. She also serves as faculty and manages its 200 plus state and local chamber member network. For the purposes of saving my voice, I could go on and on.
Not that impressive. Let's just.
And Caitlin is also, she'll probably tell you, is also a Western New Yorker. And so
Proudly.
Caitlin, thank you. Welcome. We're thrilled to have you and learn from your expertise. I know it's been a busy week for you traveling the country, sharing the good work that you've been doing, and even participating at a conversation and thought leadership at the White House. So thank you for the time that you're spending with us today. With that, I'd love to just jump right in and invite you to tell us a little bit about your background and why the business community should be prioritizing childcare from your perspective. So welcome, and please go ahead.
Well, thanks so much for having me. As Rachel mentioned, I am born and raised Buffalo, New York native, and obviously I have to start the conversation with Go Bills. I also have to say, the high school I went to, because that's the question that everyone asks you in Buffalo. I went to Holy Angels. Unfortunately, it is not still around, but it was a wonderful experience. And so much so, I moved to DC and started this work on the Hill. And then I found my way over to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in the Chamber of Commerce Foundation to work on policy issues. My background's actually in K-12. So I have focused the vast majority of the last 17 years on K-12 policy. And it wasn't until a little bit of a sort of around 10 years ago, there was a lot of conversation that was happening in DC around, 4-year-old programs. And so it was around that time that the Chamber started thinking about early childhood in a different way, and more or less thinking about it through the lens of, really early literacy as a main component of student success in the K-12 system. And it was then that we sort of undertook a report called Workforce of Today, Workforce of Tomorrow. It took us a long time to sort of develop this report because we were at the same time sort of creating a policy statement for the business community around the importance of the early years. And it wasn't until then that we really dug much, much deeper into the early care and education portfolio through the lens of childcare, as opposed to simply thinking about a 4-year-old program in addition to our existing K-12 sort of experience. And we saw that through a myriad of sort of economic data that showed, not only the lack of work supports for working parents, but also what it meant when you were able to sort of compile the care economy around the workforce of today. And we saw that through return on investment to companies. We saw that through, lost tax revenue in states that you were able to sort of gobble up lost tax revenue because you had the productivity. And we also saw that through, really a myriad of conversations that we were having with employers who were struggling at the time to attract and retain the talent necessary to really continue their operations or build and grow their operations. And I say that's important because that was 10 years ago, and we are in a much different situation now, and I wouldn't necessarily say it's a better situation now. So that's sort of the professional lens as to how we started thinking about this work. Personally, as Rachel noted, I have 2 small children myself, and I have a 4-year-old and an almost 2-year-old. And in the midst of the pandemic, I had a 6-month-old at home with us. My husband and I were both working remotely in Washington, D.C. And as I'm sure for everyone, it was like one of these moments where like we just were always working and we were trying to cobble care for our small child because we didn't have, our childcare center had closed. There was really no other option. We had a potential, our nanny had children at home that were out of school. And so we were sort of trying to figure it out. And so it was then that you have to remember the time, it was April. So it was then that I was able to convince my husband, who was born and bred Washington, D.C., said he would never move, to go to Buffalo and spend months with my parents. And we would work from there, and my parents helped watch our kid. And my husband fell in love with Buffalo, as I knew he would, because it was the best season to be in Buffalo. And so we relocated to Buffalo. And so I spend weeks in DC and back home. So not only do I understand this perspective from, certainly the policy side, but through my own experience of being a mom of 2, having to move to really better find care, but then also matriculate into the care economy in Buffalo, which is a very different experience than what we found in the Washington, D.C. area.
Caitlin, thank you. That's really helpful context, and your journey is very similar to so many working families of trying to find and navigate care while also attending to the careers and their professional interests and navigating all of it. So thank you for sharing a bit of that. Given the seed of where you sit in your history with this work, I'd love to explore a bit more with you on how the chamber has supported employees with children birth to 5 years old, the sort of examples that you've seen or heard or experienced, and the sort of showcasing of what's working for employers that you think our attendees today would like to hear more about.
Yeah, so I should probably have said this at the beginning, but for those that don't know, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is the largest business lobbying organization in the world, representing more than 3 million members, every size, sector, and region. And certainly nationally, but also internationally. And I think it's an interesting conversation around childcare and business at the moment. So when we first released this report, we went to 15 states and 15 communities and really just sort of went through the data and did almost a listening session. We called it a roadshow. And what we sort of expected on the front end of this conversation was to hear that, like we were going to have to really convince business leaders this was an issue you were dealing with and you just didn't put a name to it yet. And what we actually found after going through this like litany of events was that we had business leaders coming up saying, and this was large scale companies to small scale, saying, you don't need to tell me this is a problem. This is a problem. I don't know how to solve it. I am, an employer that, I have 15 employees, I have 100 employees. I don't know, I can't build an on-site center. How do I sort of solve for this problem? And it really got us thinking about the role that employers should play, but also the background information that they might need to know before they sort of, or as they sort of jump into this conversation. And so we got to work then, and again, this is prior to the pandemic. The pandemic happened, and it was on the mouth of every employer that we were having conversations with, really illuminating the fact that you're on a call, but your small child is also on your lap. Like, it really sort of brought employers into the family room of their employees, and realizing that the balance of work and life is a unique challenge that employees were dealing with at the moment. And so we created a resource called the Child Care Roadmap, which is solutions for working parents, but it's sort of a roadmap for employers to sort of start the conversation, right? Like, where do you start trying to find solutions, and then understanding sort of the lift of each of these solutions? We and so I'll name a couple of these, but the first thing that we say every single time we talk to an employer that is struggling with this reality is, number one, you have got to survey your working parents. You have to understand the challenges that they are experiencing. In a bunch of state reports that we have done and surveys that we have done, actually, employees have called out the number one thing that could really solve the challenges that they're experiencing is predictive scheduling. Hourly wage workers, their number one thing that they said, predictive scheduling. That's actually not an enormous lift for for any employer to do, right? Putting out a schedule that gives you multiple months of knowing every Tuesday, every Thursday, every Saturday, these are the hours I'm working, so that parents can find the care that they are comfortable with, right? Whether that be a family friend or neighbor, whether that be high quality childcare center, whether that be, one of the myriad of options that exists in the 7, county area. And so that's number one, is figuring out what the issue is. And then number two is sort of going down the line of the true expense that a company is going to have to put towards this, but also sort of understand the lift that it takes. If you are Rich Products and you're building an on-site childcare center to support your employees, you need to know the upfront costs that that's going to take. You need to know the partner that you're going to work with. Are you going to increase capacity within the community? Are you going to focus solely on your employees? Are you going to work with a community partner that already has a center and is wanting to grow? Are you going to work with, sort of Bright Horizons or KinderCare, or one of the options that are sort of more nationwide? But also understand the quality component of all of this. It's not just having a place for the kids to be. There is a high quality factor that is absolutely important to the success of all of these programs, and for the comfort of the parents who are, ultimately going to make the decision on where they're going to put their children so that they can go to work. So, this roadmap I can point you to, or Rachel, I can send you the link after so you can send it out, has sort of come with it a lot of examples of how companies have used this. So one I already called out, predictive scheduling, being a really sort of easy, light lift, but something that has made a huge difference to employees. Others have been, understanding some of the challenges around backup care, right? Like, my kid is sick, I need to find a place. There are, a number of options that sort of help parents matchmake to find for these like one day solutions, not necessarily wholesale. There's navigators out there that also work with parents to, as like an employee benefit, work with parents to find spots in their community and help get their kids on lists. And, of course, There are also, the really intense work about in actually building an on-site center. And, of course, in New York State, we're seeing a bit of that with some of the growth of the semiconductor industry that's happening in and around the Buffalo region. So I'll stop there because I could talk about that for a long time.
Well, and I'm sure that there's several folks on this call that would love to dig in to the CHIPS Act, and I bet you could spend hours talking about that. But for now, and I also want to say, Caitlin, thank you. I was one of those, and many folks on today's meeting experienced a pop-up of Vivian during the pandemic asking for a snack while we were trying to deliberate on strategy of how to influence the New York State budget. So certainly appreciate that comment and that perspective. Knowing that Liftoff is an aligned action network, a collaboration of leaders, our nucleus is philanthropy, but we have the engagement of the business community, the higher ed community, and many other cross-sectoral leaders. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about a collaboration that has included business, early childhood, childcare policymakers, either at a local or state level, and what sort of solutions were they focused on? And then could you talk maybe through some of the details of that so that we could take those learnings and steal them for our work with Liftoff?
Yeah. No, it's such a great question. And I think that's the unique place that we are in right now in the US, right? We'll potentially talk a little bit about federal policy in a bit, but what we've said on childcare is like the states are really cooking. There is a huge amount of action taking place in states. And I think the exciting thing about that is that it really is blue states as much as red states. There is just a lot of action. And I think it's pouring into this idea that childcare is not just a social issue, it is an economic issue. And I think adding data to the economics of this challenge has really allowed us to push this issue and really build some momentum. So I'll say that one thing that the Chamber Foundation has spent a good bit of time on in the last couple of years has been quantifying the costs to quantifying the costs to states and to the business community when this issue is left sort of on the table. So, in a state like Texas, you're looking at $9.8 billion of lost tax revenue and lost revenue to companies because we have not solved for childcare. In a state like Pennsylvania, that looks closer to $2 billion. In a state like Iowa, that looks closer to like $120 million. We're still talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, because childcare has been left out of conversations around workforce development, and certainly left out of conversations around, how are we sort of supporting our current workforce, and of course, importantly, building the workforce of the future with the skills necessary. So we have spent a good bit of time in states to sort of not only quantify this data, but to sort of collaborate on how do you use this as a turning point to move policymakers to see a broader frame of reference here. It's not just a question, again, of like where we're going to put the kids. It's a question of if your 5-year plan is to hire tens of thousands of individuals in construction or in semiconductors or in hospitals or in IT or you name it, you have to solve for this issue. And it can't be sort of a one-size-fits-all solution, and it certainly cannot be done solely at the sort of work of the employer. It has to be community-led if it's going to make a sustainable impact for the community as a whole. And I think like that's the really, really important aspect here. We've seen a lot of action, as I've said, in states. I'll call out a couple. One is Michigan, if you've heard of Michigan's TriShare program, by like just the head nods. No? Okay. So Michigan has done like a really unique sort of work here, and it's actually spread to a handful of states. It's tri-share is really it is in its definition. So it's a cost sharing model for childcare that is 1/3 covered by the state, 1/3 covered by the employer, and 1/3 covered by the employee. And so it is a high quality childcare center that was essentially funded through this method. And what it does is they created these in regions of high growth and high need. And so it was a pilot program 2 years ago. It is now fully baked in. I won't say fully funded because, of course, like it requires a multitude of funding schemes through a state. But it is baked in. It is part of, sort of an ongoing. They have moved it from a pilot to a project. And now it's being looked at and examined, and in a lot of cases already have language for bills in Kentucky, North Carolina, Florida, and Texas. So it's one of these models that have really shown an opportunity for the state to put up money, for the business community to put up money, but also for the individual that is seeking services to put up money to sort of share the costs of what this high quality center will be. Another one example is Vermont. Vermont recently passed a payroll tax increase. And the unique thing about this is the business community vis-a-vis the Vermont Chamber of Commerce was the ones that were really creating this as the avenue to go. They were not saying like, don't tax us. They were saying, yes, we have an issue with childcare. We recognize we have an issue with childcare. We also recognize alone, we are not going to make the impact we need for our employees or the communities in which we live and work. So if the state is willing to take this on and do it through this mechanism of funding, we are willing to be taxed at that rate. And so, I think that's like a really fascinating look at a collaborative conversation. Did we get to that because they had one happy hour and they were like, what's an issue? Childcare. No, like it was years of conversations where they were trying to find fixes to a problem that they had in some cases named and in some cases hadn't named yet. And they sort of coalesced around this issue being the one that they need to solve for. And now they are making steps and already have this in law that will allow them to put funding towards the necessary, sort of components to this. Another example, not through the finish line, but I think interesting nonetheless, is Alaska. The Alaska Department of Health had moved to ease parts of their childcare licensing burden, which had been logistically difficult or prohibitively costly. And it actually resulted in little or no childcare in parts of the state. They did this in partnership with a number of groups, including their CCR&R, which in Alaska is called THREAD, to really identify what these burdensome regs were and how could they figure out how to alleviate some of this. They also put a bunch of cost into the budget that they're still working through right now, but adding potentially millions of dollars to get to these childcare deserts that exist in Alaska would be game changing for the state, and a place that had, prior to the sort of business engagement on this issue, had not necessarily moved much or at all. I think for sake of time, again, this is another one that we could just go tick down the line, but let's see, maybe I'll just point out that the North Carolina legislature just recently approved a 2-year pilot program for their tri-share, for the North Carolina version of tri-share, which will be a little bit different than the Michigan version, but sort of answering the needs of North Carolina specifically, which in Mecklenburg County, those of you familiar with Charlotte, Mecklenburg County is where Charlotte sits. It's one of the densest populated regions in North Carolina, and they're struggling mightily with their childcare. And so this pilot is hyper-focused on Mecklenburg County as sort of its region to show that this can work, and then will likely go to the state. One more example in Kentucky. they were not only struggling with childcare, but as we all know, childcare workers are not necessarily raking in, right? Like the salary of childcare workers is part of the challenge. And so what Kentucky recently authorized was to pay for childcare expenses for childcare employees, which is really game-changing in a state where their childcare range salary is typically $12 an hour. The Starbucks in the same state is making $17 an hour. And so this is a benefit that really did transform the opportunity for mostly women that were in this role to find not only the passion that they had behind early childhood, but to pay for a very heavy expense that they were, having to take on by doing this job. So just, I think trying to sort of showcase the unique lens that states are sort of looking at this issue, and not just through sort of a one size fits all approach, but to really think through it and what might serve the communities that are struggling the most.
Thank you. Those are all fantastic examples, and thank you for spending some time to walk us through those. We have some folks that are part of Liftoff's leadership that have some active presence in Michigan and in Western New York with the Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation. So I might lean on them to share more in the future about the Michigan model. I also think the Alaska example is perhaps one that we can learn a little bit more about, and perhaps schedule a site visit, maybe Liftoff's next annual meeting. We could all go to Alaska to learn from them.
I would like an invite to that.
Okay, you'll join us. You'll join us. So I am conscious of time, and I wanted to put out there to our members that if they had a question that they'd like to ask, to drop it in the chat. We'll have time for one or two questions. So if you have a question, or if you'd like to raise your hand, we can make sure to call on you. And as we gather your questions or comments, I'm going to probably invite Caitlin to talk a little bit about, although it could again be weeks of conversation of what's happening at the federal level with this regard around childcare, and some of the conversation and legislation, and the winds of change that may or may not be happening and shifting. So Caitlin, with that, while we invite folks to drop their questions in the chat, if you could take a couple minutes to share and showcase some of the federal conversation, and give us the insider baseball of what's happening, so that we can have ourselves primed and ready to also pay close attention to the federal conversation.
Yeah. It's interesting. There was, you guys are all very invested in childcare, so you're well aware that Build Back Better was sort of the first entry point into thinking about this issue through a major federal investment a few years ago. For a myriad of reasons, only one of which being the vehicle in which it was happening through reconciliation. It didn't pan out, right? Like, we didn't get this $700 billion infusion into the space, and it also didn't come with sort of this essentially this state adoption requirement that would have happened. So I think there was a lot of concern, and I won't spend a lot of time talking about BBB, but there was sort of this idea like, okay, well, if this happens, what will happen in states? Because we know that there will be sort of states that adopt money and states that do not. And so, like, what will that look like? Certainly for the kids in most need in those states. I think by and large, like, New York would have adopted it, right? And so, like, it would have looked different in New York than it probably would in Mississippi. That being said, I think there is still a great deal of interest in childcare, despite the fact that, this large reconciliation package didn't get through in the way that I think there was envisioned that it would. there is still a huge amount of interest in childcare, and certainly a huge amount of interest in childcare is a workforce issue. There is no, it's no surprise that in the last 3 years, the major laws that have passed with bipartisan support all involve workforce development. You look at it as, the CHIPS Act, huge workforce development component to that. The infrastructure law, huge workforce development component of that, right? Like these are really the main stage programs that have happened in the last 2 years that have went off with bipartisan support, and both of them have this enormous component about workforce development. And I think what's interesting is how the federal government and lawmakers have sort of pivoted their eyes on childcare being a component of workforce development. In CHIPS in particular, we saw in the rulemaking around how that money would go out, that if you were making $150 million, if you were getting $150 million investment or more, you were going to have a childcare component. You were going to have to solve that issue, not just for your future workforce, but for the construction of the facility. And so, sort of our response at the chamber was to that, like that, it's great that there's, you're forcing companies to think about this through the lens of if you're getting 150, but like, if you get 149 million, you're still going to probably have a childcare crisis on your hands, right? And not only that, and I think this is like even more important as we get through, some of the announcements that will be coming out on where that money is going and where these enormous investments are going to be made. But as we all know, right, like the ripple industry that surrounds a multi-$100 million semiconductor plant is also going to need access to childcare, whether it be the cleaning staff at night or the suppliers of the, materials that they need to do the work that they're doing. And so like, it's not just solving for Micron or for, Samsung or for, you name it. It's also solving for all of the other, sort of companies that will pop up around this. And so I think that also lends itself really well to this idea of community solutions as opposed to just like what's working for one group. In terms of like where we're going to be in federal policy next year is an exciting moment in federal policy because it is considered the Super Bowl of tax. So for all you tax junkies out there, this is where you will really, really shine. There is a number of tax credits and sort of portions of the tax law that was passed in 2017 that will be up. So they will run out in 2025. And so the question becomes, are they re-upped or do they sort of pass along? And in the midst of conversations around if XYZ credit or, tax is changed, there's also a myriad of conversations around what taxes could be made better. Example of this is 45F, which is the tax code for what is also commonly referred to as the employer-provided child care tax credit, or everyone in this town loves an acronym, EPCCTC. It is a little known, it's a known tax credit. It is not used often. It's $150,000 tax credit for a corporation that is doing sort of prescriptive things on childcare as a benefit. So they're either building an on-site childcare center, brick and mortar, or they are working with almost like a resource and referral agency to help their employees sort of solve for this childcare issue themselves. So there's a lot of issues with like the usage of this, why it is so low. It is really defined small. You have to be an S Corp, which is really limiting when you think about, right, like the size of an organization that can take this on. You have to be an S Corp, so it really weeds out the vast majority of American businesses. And it also requires really for the brick and mortar center. It was created in the 80s and sort of re-upped again in the 90s. It was also at a different time of work, like we weren't sitting on a screen having a conversation from multiple zip codes, right? Like we were always in one place. And so the idea that, my employer might provide for an on-site center in Washington, D.C., but I live on Grand Island, New York, that's not going to help my problem, right? So it's really trying, like what we've been thinking about is how do you solve for this to be more flexible and move alongside the employer and really the world of work that has changed around us. I think there is a huge amount of interest from bipartisan, both House and Senate to think about what that could look like. There's already legislation out there that the chamber has been very supportive of, as has a number of state and local chambers as well. It's called the Child Care Investment Act. I could talk very deep on that, but in interest of time, I will not.
Thank you. The Super Bowl of taxes. I'm not a tax junkie, but I'm very interested, and thank you for laying out all of the different ways that we can see some movement nationally on this next year, and that reauthorization, or as we look at what's happening next as we consider the possibilities. Caitlin, I know that you have a flight to go to shortly, but in the interest of time, I didn't see any hands raised or any questions in the chat. You've mentioned quite a few resources, which Liftoff and I will be sure to share with attendees. I really appreciate all your time today and spending it with us. You are a force and have so much knowledge, and we would love to welcome you back at a future time to share more of your expertise and insights. In closing with our conversation today, I just would like to offer you the opportunity for any closing thoughts or key takeaways from today that you think our members in philanthropy would like to know and impart some wisdom before we close this portion of the program.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say that, like, 1 in 2 working parents say that their decision to leave the workforce was due to lack of childcare. This could not be more of an issue that's facing the business community, especially when we have more jobs that are open than we have people to fill them. So, every available person that wants a job should have a job. And, obviously there is an enormous workforce development component to that, but you can't even start talking about workforce development unless you've talked about the care economy and really the industry that uplifts all other industry. And so, I think I'm thrilled to have been invited to be part of this conversation, Rachel. Thrilled for the work that you guys are doing in my hometown of Western New York, but also just, happy to work alongside you in whatever way is fit to continue to bring this issue certainly to the business community, but also as a resource to building the community capacity that we know is so necessary.
Awesome. Thank you, Caitlin, very much. I'll invite those who are on the computer to give a round of applause or reaction of some hand clapping for Caitlin's joining us today. Thank you, Caitlin. And we'll look forward to staying in touch and safe flight home.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Have
Thanks
a good
so
one.
much, Caitlin. All right, my friends. Well, thank you so much. I hope that you found Caitlin's presentation valuable and some of her insights. She is a force and has this week